December 12, 1944, 0309 hours. Captain Daniel Mercer stood under a single bulb in the camp operations shack, reading a thin folder stamped "Confidential" until the letters blurred. The folder laid out what the War Department expected after serious prisoner violence. Stop the immediate threat, avoid collective reprisals, isolate individuals, and write records that could survive outside review. Mercer had accepted the posting because he believed rules prevented worse outcomes. Now the rules felt like a timer because they demanded proof and restraint while the camp was still hot. He kept reading anyway because the only alternative was improvisation, and improvisation inside wire usually ends in blood. A whistle shrieked once, then died, like someone had crushed it mid-breath. Mercer stepped into wind that cut his face and saw two military police running hard from Barracks Row toward the north latrine. Their boots hit frozen gravel in a rhythm that said, "Panic, not drill." Mercer ordered the duty sergeant to wake the reserve detail and to bring flashlights and cuffs. The order formed a response, but it also stripped the camp of spare coverage, which meant other corners would go dark at the worst moment. At the latrine door, the situation already had an audience. A German prisoner of war lay on the ground, half on concrete, half in mud, his arms pinned behind him by two other prisoners. A third knelt at his ribs and drove a fist down again and again, not wild but deliberate. Mercer pushed his men forward, grabbed the nearest attacker by the collar, and tried to peel bodies apart. The move loosened the knot, but it also pulled more prisoners closer, because every faction wanted to see whether the Americans would hesitate. The crowd thickened until it became a ring. Mercer recognized the pattern from training briefs and incident summaries. Violence inside wire spreads when spectators decide it is safe. He raised his pistol, aimed into the air at a safe angle, and fired one warning shot. The crack snapped through wood and wire and made every head turn. The shot bought a half-second of stillness, but it also created a new story that would travel through the compound faster than any written order. Mercer used the stillness. He ordered all prisoners back to the wall with hands visible and told his sergeant to pull the closest men out one at a time. The command separated bodies and opened a corridor for the medical officer, who arrived with a field bag and knees that already looked tired. The separation ended the beating, but it also burned minutes, and minutes are where retaliation makes plans. The medical officer knelt by the injured prisoner and assessed him with blunt speed: a fractured jaw, bruising across the ribs, a puncture wound near the shoulder that bled more than it should and had missed the lung by luck. Mercer told the medical officer to write everything down with measurements, to record the time, and to keep the notes as if they would be read in court. The instruction turned pain into an anchor for later accountability, but it also turned the victim into evidence, which meant the victim would be watched by both sides. Mercer looked at the three men closest to the assault. Two stared at the ground. The third held Mercer's gaze with calm that did not belong in a sudden fight. Mercer did not ask why. He ordered cuffs and marched the three into temporary isolation, then logged their names from memory before memory could shift. The isolation removed immediate threats, but it also announced that someone had been selected, and selection is how camps divide. By 0345 hours, Mercer ordered Barracks Row into a partial restriction. When a runner reported whispering clusters and bed slats tapped like signals in the south end, Mercer widened it into full camp lockdown and divided the compound into zones. The decision boxed the fire into a smaller space and kept groups from forming. But it also trapped men who had done nothing and created a shared grievance that any agitator could spend. Back in the operations shack, Mercer reread the confidential guidance and forced himself to see its logic. The United States did not avoid collective punishment out of softness. It avoided it because collective punishment strengthened factions, invited retaliation, and broke treaty obligations that protected captured Americans overseas. Procedure was not mercy. Procedure was a tool to keep a camp from becoming its own battlefield. That understanding steadied Mercer, but it also raised the standard he would be held to if anyone later questioned his choices. He requested the camp commander immediately and asked for the legal officer from town. He also requested an interpreter who could handle more than vocabulary, someone who could recognize rehearsed phrases and evasions. The requests pulled the incident into formal process, but they also invited outside scrutiny into decisions made in the dark, including his warning shot. At 04:15 hours, Mercer walked Barracks Row with his sergeant and marked what he could not see. Floodlights made bright islands and deep shadows. The latrine wall blocked line of sight from one guard post, and a storage shed created a blind pocket where men could gather without being watched. Mercer ordered the shed moved at first light and doubled the roving patrol, even though it would exhaust his men. The changes reduced opportunity for a second assault, but they also pushed fatigue toward the edge, and tired guards miss small movements that prisoners never miss. He returned to the latrine and watched evidence collection. A broken spoon had been ground into a crude point, wrapped in cloth to protect the hand that used it. A belt buckle was smeared with blood. Near the wall, a scrap of paper held 3 names and a drawn mark shaped like a cross. Mercer ordered each item sealed and logged with time, location, and handler. The seals strengthened the chain of custody, but they also made every prisoner search feel like a verdict, which hardened silence. Mercer opened the camp roster and checked the names. One belonged to a kitchen worker with access to tools, heat, and movement. Another belonged to a prisoner who had applied for outside work and been denied. The third name belonged to no one on the roster. Mercer underlined that absence, because absence inside a roster usually means false identity, deliberate misdirection, or a message meant for a different audience. The underlining gave Mercer a lead, but it also confirmed how quickly rumor could outrun records. Before first light, Mercer began interviews. He kept them one at a time, with the interpreter beside him and a clerk writing in steady strokes. Mercer asked where each man had been at 0300 hours, who had left the barracks, what had been said, and who had touched the victim. The questions built a lattice of statements that could be compared, but the lattice also revealed its holes, because the safest answer in a factional camp is often that nothing happened. Most prisoners claimed they slept. Some said they heard nothing until the whistle. 2 claimed the victim provoked the assault. Mercer listened for details that do not match rehearsals. Odd times, mistaken directions, unnecessary names. The interpreter's eyes flickered when a phrase repeated too neatly across different mouths, the same sentence delivered with the same cadence. Mercer marked those statements with dots in the margin. The dots gave him a pattern to test, but acting on a pattern without proof could turn the camp against him faster than any riot. At 06:15 hours, the camp commander arrived, coat buttoned wrong from haste. Mercer briefed him with facts only: time, location, injuries, names, evidence seals, and restrictions already in place. The commander asked how close the camp was to a riot. Mercer answered with the only honest measure he had: close enough that nightfall would decide whether the camp stayed a camp. The answer earned approval for continued lockdown and formal proceedings, but it also tied Mercer's judgment to the commander's name, which meant the commander would demand results, not just caution. When the morning shift changed, Mercer inspected guard posts and logs for weaknesses the prisoners could exploit. He found a 10-minute gap left blank on a sentry record and pulled the guard aside. The guard admitted he had stepped away to warm his hands at a stove. Mercer wrote the lapse into the incident file and reassigned the guard. The admission made the record honest and prevented later accusations of cover-up, but it also created resentment inside the guard detail, because discipline always produces a person who feels wronged. By midday, the camp held under restriction. Men lined up for meals under watch, eyes forward, mouths closed. Mercer walked the line and listened for the sound of a crowd deciding it no longer feared consequences. He heard only boots, metal trays, and the low hum of forced restraint. The quiet bought Mercer time, but it also proved the deeper danger. The factions were reorganizing, not calming down. Late afternoon brought a test. A runner reported 2 prisoners dragged behind the wash station, out of direct light. Mercer arrived with 3 men and found the scuffle ending, one prisoner with a split lip, the other with a torn shirt. Neither would speak. Mercer did not force a confession. He wrote the names, noted the time, checked both for hidden points, and moved them to different zones. The separation prevented a new crowd from forming, but it also taught the prisoners that silence still worked, which meant future witnesses would require protection, not persuasion. That night, Mercer ordered emergency headcounts in each zone at irregular intervals. The head counts disrupted gatherings and kept men from moving in groups, but they also kept guards moving until their knees ached and tempers shortened. During the second head count, Mercer watched a quiet prisoner glance toward the isolation building, then look away fast. Mercer called the prisoner forward under the pretext of checking a work assignment and saw fear, not guilt. The small move created a thread to pull later, but it also risked exposing a man who might already be targeted. Mercer returned to the operations shack and built a timeline on a chalkboard. Whistle, response, separation, medical assessment, evidence seals, interviews, and guard log gaps. He had stopped the beating and trapped the camp in rules. The result was a temporary calm held by exhaustion. The cost was that calm had to be paid for hour by hour, and Mercer was running out of hours. December 13th, 1944. 6:30 hours. The legal officer arrived from town in a staff car and walked into the shack without looking at the prisoners outside. He was a major with a leather case and a face trained to distrust stories that arrive without documentation. Mercer handed him the incident file and the evidence log and pointed to the chalk timeline. The handoff pulled the violence into a legal frame, but it also invited scrutiny into every decision Mercer made when bodies were moving. The major read fast and asked one question first. Why did Mercer fire? Mercer answered with geometry, not emotion. He described the crowd ring, the exits, the number of military police on hand, and how quickly a beating becomes a riot when spectators decide to join. The answer made the warning shot look like a measured tool used to gain separation, but it also fixed Mercer on the record as the man who discharged a weapon inside a prisoner compound, which meant future decisions would be judged against that moment. They agreed to convene a military commission inside the camp that morning. Waiting for a civilian court or a later review would give factions time to coordinate, intimidate, and retaliate. The legal officer demanded a clean chain of custody and warned Mercer that any sloppy handling would collapse the case. The schedule moved the camp toward a public decision, but it also tightened the time window for protection because witnesses who speak in the morning can be punished at night. Mercer used the hours before the hearing to tighten control without provoking a stampede. He reinforced the zone lines, assigned guards by pair rather than alone, and ordered that all movement between zones require written authorization. He moved the calm-eyed prisoner into solitary confinement and logged the reason as preventive isolation pending investigation. The move cut off direct coordination, but it also gave the prisoner's followers a symbol, and symbols travel even when bodies cannot. Mercer then extracted the key witness, Ernst Keller, during a public headcount. Mercer ordered Keller forward, walked him to a separate holding room, and posted a guard who could not understand German insults or pleas. The extraction shielded Keller from immediate reach, but it also labeled him in every mind watching, and labels inside wire can be as dangerous as blades. In the holding room, Mercer offered Keller no comfort. He offered procedure. He said the camp would judge individuals, not tribes, and that the only alternative was more violence that would swallow everyone. The interpreter translated carefully. Keller finally spoke. He said he saw the pointed spoon pass from the kitchen worker to the calm-eyed prisoner 2 nights earlier. He said the victim was called a traitor in the barracks and that men were told to watch who spoke to Americans. The statement formed a chain that matched Mercer's evidence and patterns. The cost was that Keller had now placed himself on that chain as a visible link. Mercer confronted the kitchen worker again before the hearing. He did not threaten. He presented the evidence seal number on the spoon and asked one question that mattered. Who instructed preparation? The interpreter translated clause by clause because meaning hides in shortcuts. The kitchen worker denied, then hesitated, then claimed coercion. The shifting answer cracked the unified story of a spontaneous fight, but it also complicated responsibility, because coercion is both a truth and a convenient shield. At 7:10 hours, the commission convened in a converted supply room. 3 officers sat as the panel. The legal officer served as prosecutor and clerk together, and the interpreter sat between languages like a bridge made of rope. Mercer stood by the door with 2 guards and watched the room rather than the testimony, because intimidation is often silent. The hearing began on rails with identity confirmation against the roster. The cost of rails was that there would be no informal release valve. Every statement would create a consequence. The medical officer testified first and described injuries with the calm brutality of measurement. bruising across ribs, fractured jaw, puncture wound near the shoulder with a track suggesting a pointed instrument. He produced written notes and confirmed times. The testimony removed doubt that a weapon was used and raised the severity above a simple brawl. The cost was that severity demanded a response that would not satisfy the prisoners who wanted internal discipline and would not satisfy prisoners who feared internal discipline. Mercer presented the evidence bags in order. He read seal numbers aloud, described the locations and named each handler. He showed the pointed spoon, the cloth wrap, the bloodied buckle, and the scrap of paper with names and the crude cross. The legal officer asked whether Mercer could prove what the cross meant. Mercer answered that he could prove presence, not intention, and that presence mattered because fear follows symbols. The careful answer kept the paper inside the case without turning it into a confession. The cost was that careful answers rarely feel satisfying to men who want certainty. The accused prisoners were brought in. 2 tried to look smaller, 1 tried to look larger. The calm-eyed prisoner looked almost bored. The legal officer confirmed each name and asked whether each understood the charges. The interpreter translated. The calm-eyed prisoner replied in a tone that sounded respectful but carried a hook. Judgment belonged to Germans, not Americans. The interpreter hesitated, then translated. The hesitation was small, but it reminded Mercer that language could shift outcomes. The cost was that the interpreter now carried pressure from both sides, and pressure breaks fidelity. Keller testified. Mercer kept guards close enough that the accused could feel their distance. Keller stared at the panel rather than the prisoners and described the spoon transfer and the traitor label. When defense questioning began, Keller's voice shook. The calm-eyed prisoner tapped one finger on his thigh in a slow rhythm, not loud enough to be called a threat, but clear enough to be understood. Mercer ordered the accused moved back and told the guard to face the prisoners, not the witness. The tapping stopped and Keller's voice steadied. The cost was that Mercer made himself the focus of the room's hostility, and hostility does not evaporate when a hearing ends. A second witness, a laundry worker, claimed no weapon was used and that the victim started the fight. Mercer presented the medical notes and asked how a puncture wound appears without a point. The interpreter translated. The witness shifted, then claimed the victim carried a tool. The contradiction did not solve the case, but it revealed the pressure shaping testimony. The panel gained clarity about fear's role. The cost was that clarity did not create safety. It only created a reason for the faction to punish anyone who looked weak. Midway through questioning, the interpreter translated a word for discipline into a word closer to punishment. The legal officer stopped the session and demanded clarification. Mercer watched the interpreter correct himself and repeat the full sentence. The record was repaired, but the pause made every person in the room aware that a single wrong word could reignite the camp. The cost of that awareness was that future answers tightened, and tightened answers lose detail. The panel recessed to deliberate. Mercer used the recess to keep the compound from turning delay into a rally. He staggered meal lines by zone, posted guards at corners where men liked to gather, and ordered a patrol to walk the fence line without stopping. The control reduced chance encounters and prevented a crowd from forming. The cost was more pressure, and pressure in confinement turns into resentment even when no one can act on it. The panel returned with findings. Assault and incitement to violence were sustained against the kitchen worker and the calm-eyed prisoner. 2 other men were found responsible for restraining the victim. The sentence was segregation and transfer to a higher security facility with immediate removal to prevent reprisals. The decision closed the case on paper and drew a line inside the compound. The cost was that a line inside wire is never neutral. It becomes a boundary that men test. Mercer did not allow the sentence to sit. He scheduled transfers for that night and planned them like an operation against his own camp. He separated the convicted prisoners into different isolation rooms, prevented contact, and kept meals silent and brief. The preparation reduced coordination and the chance of a rescue attempt. The cost was that guards now had to manage men who knew they were being removed, which is when desperation grows sharp. Mercer also moved Keller under an administrative pretext. He did not write witness protection because paper words can become deadly if they leak. He wrote reassignment, logged the time, and assigned a trusted sergeant to the move. The transfer gave Keller a chance at anonymity elsewhere. The cost was that Mercer turned a witness into freight, and freight does not get asked whether it wants to move. Mercer signed the transfer paperwork with a pen that felt heavier than his pistol. The result was a verdict and a plan to cut the revenge chain. The cost was the night, because the most dangerous hours are the hours between decision and execution. December the 13th, 1944, 23:10 hours. Mercer stood at the gate while the first truck idled, exhaust turning to white fog. He loaded the first convicted prisoner with guards on both sides and kept the man's head down. He sent the truck out by a route that did not pass Barracks Row. The route prevented a spectacle and reduced the chance of a crowd forming. The cost was extra miles on unlit roads, and extra miles at night increased the odds of accident or an escape attempt. He repeated the process for the second and third trucks, staggering departures so no one inside the compound could predict the pattern. Each departure cut a strand from the revenge chain. Each departure also fed rumor, because confined men invent explanations when they do not see facts. Keller left on the final truck, seated under a blanket, not for comfort, but to hide his face from anyone watching through fence slats. Mercer watched the truck pass the gate and felt a brief, hard relief. The relief lasted seconds. The cost was immediate. Keller's removal confirmed to some prisoners that Keller had spoken, and confirmation is enough to direct future violence toward anyone suspected of the same. After the trucks disappeared into the fields, Mercer walked the compound. He listened for movement near the fence, tapping inside barracks, and the quiet shuffling that means men are not sleeping. He found a guard leaning too heavily on his rifle and ordered him to walk because stillness breeds inattention. The order kept the guard alert and the patrol moving. The cost was that Mercer sounded cruel to tired men, and cruelty, real or imagined, corrodes trust. In the following week, Mercer rewrote routine. He broke up work details that had been dominated by one faction, rotated assignments, and required written authorization for any group movement. He increased random searches, but paired them with receipts and logs to prevent accusations of theft. The changes reduced organized intimidation. The cost was constant friction, the feeling of a tightened collar around everyone, guards and prisoners alike. Mercer also changed how information moved. He required patrol reports to include not just locations and times, but observations of gathering behavior, signals, and signs of fear. He trained sergeants to notice what he noticed. Silence after provocation is not calm, it is coordination. The change improved early warning. The cost was that it turned daily life into surveillance, and surveillance turns every interaction into a potential report. Weeks later, the injured prisoner returned to his barracks with his jaw set in a crude splint and his shoulder wrapped. Mercer saw him once at a meal line. The prisoner looked past Mercer as if Mercer was a fence post. Mercer did not speak to him, because conversation would change nothing and could invite new attention. The distance prevented immediate conflict. The cost was that Mercer would never know whether his actions had saved a man or only postponed his suffering. As winter turned, the camp settled into a colder form of order. There were fewer open fights and fewer crowd movements at night. The system held. The cost was the tone of the place. Men moved like they were being measured. Guards moved like they were being judged. Mercer had built a rule world, and rule worlds do not feel friendly. When the war ended, the camp began to empty in stages. Trucks came in, names were read, men marched out with duffel bags and hard faces. Mercer filed reports into boxes for long-term storage. The boxes contained neutral ink about fear and pain. And neutrality was necessary because records must be cold to be trusted. The cost was that coldness erased the sensory truth of the night, and erased truth returns later as rumor. Years later, after Mercer had been reassigned and promoted, a civilian investigator requested a sworn statement about the riot and the commission. Mercer sat at a desk, opened his old incident report, and read his own words as if they belonged to someone else. The statement matched the evidence seals and the hearing record. It was accurate. The cost was what accuracy left out, the way a label spreads faster than fire, and the way one warning shot can echo longer than any sentence. Mercer signed the sworn statement and closed the file. He had fired to stop a beating. That act produced a chain: isolation, evidence, testimony, verdict, transfer, and a camp that stayed inside its rules. The cost was simple and permanent. In a prison of war, the most volatile weapon is not a blade, but a name. And the only thing that can blunt it is a record strong enough to hold when everyone wants it to break.